Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm Rob Reed.
And I'm Tom Meritt. And this is a special episode designed around the book After On.
Each of these special episodes focuses on one aspect of the science, tech, and social issues explored in the novel. Now, you don't have to read After On in order to learn from or enjoy these podcasts.
That's because we wait until the very end to discuss the book in detail and to really tie it to this week's topic.
That last section will make perfect sense if you're reading the novel. But if you're not reading it, just tune out at that point. You can always come back if you decide to read it later.
And we'll warn you before we get to that part. But first, we have a lot of things to talk about, which should be interesting to everybody. Specifically, superintelligence and the risks we face from it. Discussing this with us today is filmmaker and author James Barrat. Now, Rob, how did you come to choose James as a guest?
Well, a few years back, James wrote a book called Our Final Invention that heavily influenced my own thinking on super AI risk, and also that of Elon Musk, who basically helped tweet the book to prominence.
Now, James' book, plus Elon's helpful endorsement, really helped put the whole subject of superintelligence risk on the public agenda, didn't it?
Absolutely. And it was actually three things that happened in rapid succession. James's book came out first, and a few months later, Nicholas Bostrom released a more academic book on the same subject. Then Elon tweeted about both of them, and almost overnight, everyone in tech seemed to be talking about super AI risk. And they never really stopped. It's almost like Elon gave the industry permission to worry about something that had secretly been on a lot of minds for a while.
Well, it certainly remains a big issue, so let's get right into your conversation with James.
James, thank you so much for joining me in this interview today.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Now, before we get into the enthralling topic of superintelligence risk, I'd love to go just briefly over your professional background as a documentary filmmaker and the other things that you've done before you dove into the story.
I've been making documentary films for over 20 years for National Geographic and Discovery and PBS, and I lived in Europe and made films for European television.
Mm-hmm.
I got into artificial intelligence through documentary around the year 2000. I made a film about 2001, A Space Odyssey, about the collaboration between Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. And for that, I got to interview Ray Kurzweil, who was a hero of mine at the time and still kind of is.
Because of HAL 9000, I assume, because of the computer that gained sentience in the middle of the movie, that was the vector into Ray, who at the time was already big into what I don't know if he was calling it the singularity yet, but he certainly was writing about it.
He had just written a book that just knocked my socks off called The Age of Spiritual Machines.
Yep.
And in that, he anticipates that we'll have machines that are as intelligent in a general sense as humans by 2029. He says it there. And then he goes off into that and how ultimately these technological advances in bio, info, cogno, and nano will lead to our immortality. And I was really interested in the AI piece of that. And I wanted to talk to him about artificial intelligence and its advancement and superintelligence. And he was very optimistic, as he still is, about the day that will come and we'll share the planet with smarter than human machines. I interviewed Rodney Brooks, who was also very optimistic. Rodney Brooks has created the company iRobot and now Rethink Robotics.
And he is the father of the famous Roomba. That was iRobotics, plus a lot of military robots, correct?
Yeah, iRobot, which a company he sold, he's no longer, I don't think he owns it anymore. They make a lot of military robots. They're mostly reconnaissance kinds of robots. In fact, I used some on a film shoot in Sudan where we were putting these robots inside pyramids that hadn't been opened for 2,500 years.
The recon robots you put into the pyramids. Wow. Now, did any of them end up getting mummies' curses?
I wish they had. No, actually, they worked great. They worked really well. They went in and they formed their own network. The furthest one ahead could send a signal back to the next one, which would then send a signal to us so we could see two robots ahead.
That is cool.
They were super cool, and they worked really, really well. Brooks, who was creating these devices, was very optimistic about the time when we'd share the planet with smarter than human machines. And then I interviewed science fiction great Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote the book 2001: A Space Odyssey and collaborated with Kubrick. And he said, "We humans steer the future not because we're the fastest or the strongest creature, but because we're the smartest. And when we share the planet with something that's smarter than us, it will steer the future." And he said, in essence, intelligence will win out in whatever form.
And that is so prescient for 2000, but of course he was the creator of HAL 9000.
Yes, and he was also, he came from a hard science background. He was a mathematician and physicist. What really helped with the creation of 2001: A Space Odyssey is he'd written a book of equations about getting a payload outside the Earth's orbit, and he'd done that before he was a science fiction writer. So when Kubrick went to NASA and said, show me your models about future spaceships, they said, if you'll bring Arthur C. Clarke with you, yes.
Wow.
He's the guy we want to meet. So Clarke came from the science background. He thought a lot about intelligence. He anticipated the day that we would be overcome by intelligent machines. So that made me think.
Yeah.
When I spoke with people who worked in AI, I always asked them about that. And I asked them one sort of telling question. In 100 years, do you think most of the important decisions about our lives will be made by machines? And almost all of them said, yes, certainly. Then I'd say, will it be a handover or a takeover? Very many of those guys who were making AI said it'll probably be a takeover.
And this was in the context of the film, or this is subsequent to the film?
This is after the film, when I was just speaking casually to AI makers and then started going to conferences and then really started interviewing them, AI makers, for my book, Our Final Invention.
It is literally impossible for me to imagine a cooler or more momentous way for someone to get engaged in this issue than yours. I mean, given that 2001: A Space Odyssey gave us our first popular depiction of a rogue AI, and you also had William Shatner as your voice, right?
Yes. So when it came to making the film, we made it, and then for narrator, we called up William Shatner, and he said, "Do you want me to do a straight narration, or do you want Shatner?" And I said, "Of course, I want Shatner."
Now, jumping ahead from the Shatner moment, the concerns you developed working on that film really must have stayed with you, because it was a full decade before you started writing your book. And that was a bold thing to do all those years later, because not only was it a big career pivot for a filmmaker, but this was long before superintelligence risk was seriously discussed, even in the tech industry. I mean, I remember exactly when this really hit the tech radar. It was when Elon Musk tweeted about your book, and also Nicholas Bostrom's book on the same subject. And that was, of course, by definition, years after you threw yourself into a cause that was not only not mainstream, but it was worse than that because of what I'll call the vampire problem. Something kind of clever you pointed out in your book, if you'd care to go into that.
Basically, I think that movies have inoculated us from thinking seriously about artificial intelligence and bad robots. It's as if the CDC issued a warning about vampires. Well, we've had so much fun with vampires that we'd all laugh about it for a while. Then we'd get serious and say, well, these vampires are a real problem.
Hollywood has also created a problematic set of expectations for how these things are going to go, right?
In Hollywood, humans always win in the end. We have a lot of fun with the tropes of bad robots and AI and Frankenstein. And in the end, a crew of hard-bitten humans just manages to win out over AI and bad robots.
Now, of course, the opposite of turning to Hollywood for our tech forecasts is to turn to the true experts in this field. But then you run into another problem, which is that most of them are evangelists and true believers, especially back when you started writing. On that subject, I'll read you one of my favorite passages from your book. You wrote, "I've listened to dozens of scientists, inventors, and ethicists lecture about superintelligence. Most consider it inevitable and celebrate the bounty the artificial superintelligence genie will grant us. Then, often in the last 2 minutes of their talks, experts note that if AI is not properly managed, it could extinguish humanity. Then their audiences nervously chuckle, eager to get back to the good news." That's definitely been my experience as well. There's usually this sort of like obligatory caveat, like, oh, by the way, this could suck. But it really is a unanimity amongst the experts for a variety of reasons, right?
Yeah, I call that the 2-minute problem because it's always at the end of the lecture and it's always sort of laughed off and there's a couple of questions and then things, people go back to the happy news. What's changed since I wrote this book, and it came out in 2013, and not because of my book, but the whole zeitgeist has changed around this because a lot of people have expressed their anxiety that they already had. Like Stephen Hawking came out and said a lot of really profound things about his fear of AI. Stuart Russell co-wrote the standard text on artificial intelligence. It's called AI, A Modern Approach. He came out and said, in the long term, we're going to have a problem controlling it. Bill Gates, no stranger to programming. He describes it much as I do, in that we're going to enjoy the confections and the advances that AI will provide in the short term, in the long term, we will run into what's referred to commonly as the control problem.
The other thing that kind of worries me is this is not something like the Manhattan Project. It won't necessarily require the resources of a nation state. A relatively small team in a research lab or a well-funded corporation could conceivably make the core breakthrough. And the people who are working on it have their own utility curves, which might differ from that of society. They're going to be the people who, might get very wealthy if they create something interesting, might get very well known. A great quote from Eliezer, I always say his last name wrong. Is it Yudkowsky?
Yudkowsky, yeah.
Yudkowsky. One of his great quotes is, many ambitious people find it far less scary to think about destroying the world than to think about never amounting to much of anything at all. Now, one of the things, as we get into the discussion, really defining the danger that you have warned about, the phrase you use a couple of times in the book is self-aware and self-improving intelligence. Would you care to go into that just a little bit?
When you get to self-aware and self-improving, which is down the road, I would say someplace, Ray Kurzweil puts smart, human machines at the price of a computer at 2029. Self-aware and self-improving is probably just after that. Mm-hmm. That really refers to an issue called the intelligence explosion. Mm-hmm. And the intelligence explosion is a term coined by statistician I.J. Good in the 60s. He was referring to a time when we create machines that are as smart as humans, and then they do everything as well as we do. Mm-hmm. And that includes artificial intelligence research and development. And you can see that happening now. You can see how realms of expertise are being taken over by AI, not just games, chess, checkers, Go, but object recognition, navigation, theorem proving, translation. Ultimately, AI will be better at it than we are.
Very soon, yeah.
Yeah, very soon. You can see right now they're developing neural nets that make better neural nets, artificial neural nets. That's a technique that's very in the front of everyone's mind right now because it's the basis of deep learning, which has been making terrific headway. According to Good and the intelligence explosion definition, at some point they'll become better than we are at artificial intelligence R&D, and then the machines will set the pace of intelligence advancement, not humans.
Right.
Now, that is when they're self-aware in that they have a model of themselves and the model of what their capabilities are, and a model of the universe in which they live. Mm-hmm. And they have that ability to improve their own cognitive architecture, to improve their own programming.
I'm sure in the 60s, when computers basically mastered checkers, people would have said, chess will never happen, or it will in a deep science fiction future. And certainly,
right.
I remember, when Kasparov lost to IBM's Deep Blue, that was like, oh, wow, that's a big deal. But at that point, had somebody asked me, when will a computer beat a human at Jeopardy? Which is such a soft and mushy knowledge domain. I would have said, God, that is so remote. Now, recognizing objects, that was very famously one of the things that computers were awful at, that humans were great at.
If you want to get a glimpse at the exponential nature of AI advancement, I think it was just 3 years ago, AI couldn't tell a cat from a dog.
Right.
Now AI is better at identifying all categories of objects.
All the breeds, all the nuances of those two things, and then all other stuff as well. And the leap from all of these things that we've seen AI conquer in the last 5 or 6 years to that one critical skill of being better than us at AI R&D doesn't seem like a longer leap than checkers to Jeopardy.
There's a huge economic wind propelling the need for better programming. As I wrote my book, each year, the United States wastes something like, I believe it's $200 billion on faulty programming. So what we waste on faulty programming is far higher than the GNP of most countries.
Yeah.
There's this huge economic incentive to create better programming and to create programs that write programs. That's already being done. There are programs that write programs.
And to pour resources into that, and obviously when resources get poured into something, you get things like flight and telephony and programs that write programs.
Yeah. Gartner and Company, which is a business analysis group, estimated that the sector of AI and robotics would be worth $25 trillion by 2025, which would be the biggest sector of the economy. So there's another exponential growth of investment. So you're going to see these results. This is not something that's going to stand still.
What's intriguing and frightening is that we've gotten well past the point that even the engineers who run the engineering programs that have resulted in certain software and services genuinely can't explain how it works because it has been internally iterating in ways that just sort of go beyond us. And one of the examples that you used in the book that I found chilling, I think is called Koza's algorithms.
Koza, it was a programmer who basically reversed engineered a lot of patents by training algorithms to recreate them. He gave the algorithms the specs of the device he wanted, and then the algorithms, like the endpoints, exactly. And so genetic algorithms work a lot like evolution. You put two algorithms together, you introduce mutations, and you let them evolve towards a goal, towards, for example, electronic specs, and they work. They do some pretty amazing things. I'd urge people to look up Koza. I believe his first name is Jonathan Koza, Koza. Using evolutionary algorithms, he famously designed an antenna for NASA that worked better than anything they had, and they did not understand why. It even had some redundant parts.
That's wild.
So genetic algorithms are something that we'll be using in advanced cognitive architectures, and already we're using. And they're wonderful in that they harness the power of evolution to deliver really stunning results. The downside is we don't really know how they work. So It's dangerous to apply them to secure systems, to systems where people's lives are at stake. Right now, neural nets are the same way. Artificial neural nets are the basis for deep learning, basically artificial neural nets plus reinforcement learning. We know what the inputs are. We see the outputs, and we adjust the outputs to what we're getting, or how well the system works by adjusting the inputs. But we don't know what's going on inside in a high-resolution sense. However, these are the same tools that are really exciting everyone in Silicon Valley with all their different applications.
Yeah, and when you have a multi-trillion-dollar market potentially on the line, market pressure, which itself is very evolutionary or evolution-like, people are going to gravitate toward that which works.
Yeah.
It is interesting that the neural net architecture has taken off in the way that it has because it's biomimetic. It's a very natural thing to take a design that has plainly worked in nature, neurons in the brain, and apply that to technology. You know, that obviously airplanes don't flap wings like birds, but we did learn a lot about aerodynamics by the way that birds' wings are shaped and curved and so forth.
Yep.
I think Bostrom particularly went into this in his book. He used the term neuromorphic, which has come to mean something very specific and slightly different in AI over the last few years. So a better term might be neuromimetic, which is basically software design based on things that happen in the brain that we kind of understand. But even if we don't understand it, we could say, well, let's set it up like it works in the brain because we know that it works there. And, you know, his point is that that is potentially the most dangerous way to approach AI. Because if we create something from the ground up, we're far more likely to understand it than if we just say, well, you know, the hippocampus looks like this. God knows what's going on in there. Let's do that. And that is, in fact, the path we're going down because biomimetic engineering works so well.
I could see why that could seem to be dangerous because you'll get none of the nuance. You might get the power, but you won't get the nuance. Right. Again, you would probably sacrifice control.
And you might move very, very quickly toward the endpoint because you're using stuff that in fact works, even though you don't entirely understand it. And also, not just self-aware and self-improving, but I think where it gets quote-unquote interesting and potentially very dangerous is if we add willful and something that has its own set of objectives, which might be completely orthogonal to ours as its creator. What are some of the things that we might imagine an emergent intelligence would have as drives and goals?
I spoke with Steve Omohundro, he's an AI maker, teacher. Really, I urge people to look up Steve Omohundro's basic drives. And what he does is he applies rational agent economic theory to superintelligence. Broadly speaking, that economic theory was developed to try to anticipate how rational agents, humans, would buy and sell. Mm-hmm. And so it said that rational agents will always work to satisfy their goals and preferences, towards their goals and preferences, which they call utility function. Now, it didn't work at all with humans because we're not rational. We buy on the spur of the moment. We buy stupidly. We spend our money willy-nilly, and then we save it for the wrong reasons. But it should work with logic-based machines like computers.
And this was a 60s era economic theory. Like, when did this come about?
Probably, I believe it was the 50s, and I know that John von Neumann had a lot to do with developing it. And it was basically tried and discarded. But now in economics, game theory, decision theory, and AI, a rational agent, it models uncertainty. It works to try to take advantage of an environment that it doesn't have perfect knowledge about.
Yep.
So it tries to perform actions with optimal expected outcome for itself. So based on that, Steve Omohundro derives 4 basic drives. One will be basic survival. Don't turn me off.
Mm-hmm.
If the machine is turned off, it can't satisfy its goals and preferences. So that would be the ultimate bad news. So it will develop basic self-protection.
Mm-hmm.
It will want to acquire resources because, again, if it doesn't have resources, whether that's actual computer power or money or whatever it needs to achieve its goals, if it doesn't have it, that's bad news for it. So it needs resources. It needs to be efficient about managing its resources because, again, it's operating in a world in which it has imperfect knowledge. So it doesn't know how long the resources will last. And then it will want to be creative. It will want to be creative about all these things, about anticipating resource blockages, anticipating what might turn it off and then stopping whatever might turn it off. It would behoove it to create a sub-goal about improving its own intelligence.
Because intelligence, regardless of its objective, is going to be helpful, if only because that intelligence will help it be better and better and better at not getting turned off, better and better and better at getting more CPUs and electricity and so forth.
Exactly. Better at all these things, and ultimately better at achieving its goals. Whether its goals are to play chess or to mine asteroids, or to manufacture paper clips in Nick Bostrom's famous example.
That creative part, the fourth one that you cited, I didn't realize how significant that was until just now in our conversation, because I've seen Omohundro's list. For some reason, I'd always thought, and the computer's going to want to be creative. It's going to want to write great rock songs and solve relativity. It's like, no, it's not. I mean, it might, but no, I get it now. It wants to be really creative about its don't turn me off strategies. And one of the first things that it might rationally decide to eliminate from its environment are the only things that are going to turn it off, which are not zebras. It's not mosquitoes aren't going to turn it off. Now, if we're lucky, it'll come to view us as being its microbiome. And we don't want to get rid of our gut bacteria. But if we were a lot smarter than we are, we could probably figure out a way of getting the benefits that we get from our microbiome without necessarily having trillions of bacteria free riding in our guts.
Another scary aspect of that is that it might, as it becomes increasingly intelligent, it might anticipate problems that haven't arisen yet, that may arise coming down the road.
Yeah.
The smarter it gets, arguably, the more protective it will get because it'll have greater apprehension of the future, greater apprehension of future enemies.
Yes. And a very different definition of the future than you or I have, because time is going to be a completely different notion to it.
Yep.
It's not going to die a biological death in X decades if it plays its cards right. It could be worried about things that could literally happen millions of years hence.
It's interesting. The other day, Facebook had a funny thing happen.
Yes.
Not in a ha-ha sense, where two software devices, two software bots were developing their own way of communicating. And it was a very primitive way of communicating, but humans couldn't understand it. And they were negotiating for finite resources. And they were using negotiating tactics that they had not been taught. For example, it's, crows do this. They pretend not to care about a resource and they fly away from it. And so other crows watching go, we don't need that either because Bob doesn't need that.
It obviously sucks. Yeah.
Yeah. It obviously sucks, or else he'd take it. And then Bob later comes back and snarfs it down. This is exactly the behavior that these two very primitive pieces of software were exhibiting.
Wow.
Well, a certain amount of behavior I think we're going to find inherent in complex systems.
And one of the things, this is where the Hollywood problem kind of re-enters the equation, because it's hard to imagine machines hating us, right? Just this visceral kind of like, man, I want to kill all these wretched humans type of thing. Yeah. And I think by seeing that and on rejecting it on a gut level in the same way that we reject, the plausibility of Spider-Man, it's easy to sort of leap into a more soothing narrative, which says, well, wait, we're going to be like their parents. It's a rare person who wants to just off mom and dad. We will be the the thing that has spawned them, and they're going to realize that.
And be grateful, yeah.
What is your response to that? The gratitude scenario, let's call it.
Eliezer Yudkowsky said once, the biggest mistake we can make is anthropomorphizing machines. We impute motive to inanimate objects all the time.
Yeah.
It's thundering outside, so the thunder gods are angry.
Or my computer's out to get me, because why else would it crash right then?
Right. Or, today is cursed because three bad things have happened.
Yeah.
We anticipate that machines will be like us, and that's the source of huge error. They won't love us and they won't hate us unless we can code love and hate into them. They may have goals that conflict with ours, and unless they're taught not to kill us, they'll see us as so much furniture. I mean, machines don't love you or hate you any more than your toaster.
One of the great analogies that you used in your book was the fact that we share a great deal of DNA with flatworms.
Sure.
They are in a very real way, linearly going way, way back, kind of like our ancestors. And if not that, at least like our cousins. But that doesn't really make us terribly urgent about the well-being of flatworms. And actually, in my novel, I only quoted one real-world source, even though my novel is very, very science-based. The only quote that I had, and it was by a very kind of comical character. So when you get to that point in the book, if you do, James, you'll get a kick out of it. But it was your quote. It said, "Do we ask lab monkeys for their opinions before we crush their heads to learn about sports injuries? We don't hate mice or monkeys, yet we treat them cruelly." And that's the point. They don't have to hate us to decide that we're just orthogonal to that which they want. And it may be something that's even way, way further out, than doing experiments on us because we're useful biological models. They're not going to really care about biological models, but they may care a great deal about, it was Eliezer who says, the atoms that comprise us.
He says, the machines won't love you or hate you, but you're comprised of atoms that may find useful for something else.
Yeah.
That goes to the biggest challenge of our time. How do you make the machines of the future care about us? MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, is trying to make friendly AI. Mm-hmm. The Future of Life Institute talks about how to achieve friendly AI. And what they're talking about is creating machines that don't destroy us, that don't use up so many resources that we can't coexist. But then if you really look at it, it's a very tough problem, because if you try to tell a computer, respect all human life, well, in any room full of people, you'll have an argument about when human life begins. So you can't really define human life very clearly. And if you move around the world, there are a lot of places where women and children aren't acknowledged as the same kind of life as men. So it's really hard to define and codify basic human values
when we don't have unanimity ourselves.
Exactly. At the same time, some people are trying to codify friendly AI. Other people in the same AI and automation business are trying to create machines to kill people. There's probably a lot more money going into trying to create machines to kill people without a human in the loop than there is in people trying to make friendly AI.
And as you, again, I'm sorry to continually quote your book to you, but there's so many great turns of phrase.
Please.
I think at one point you said DARPA will want its money back if superintelligence makes soldiers super friendly. There is no question about that. And, this interesting thing about the atoms, when I first heard it, I was very, very skeptical about it, because it's like, how much biomass do humans really represent? And, if I imagine that a super AI, yes, it could master nanotechnology, because we seem to be on a long-term path to doing that. Once you've mastered nanotechnology, any matter could be turned into any other matter. So might a super AI turn the things around it into a computing substrate? Like, Rob seems to like his desk an awful lot, but man, there's a lot of processing power in those atoms if I reconfigure them. But what you start realizing as you get on this path is not the cartoon Terminator scenario of like putting all of us into a cauldron and turning our bodies into a computer. It's like 99.999% of the mass that's immediately at hand, we kind of need it to generate comfortable gravity for us. And the veneer that's on top of it, we humans need it to be our biosphere.
Yeah.
That's where the money is, in a sense, if you're super AI with nanotechnology capabilities. Now, you mentioned these two institutes that are working on friendly AI. Could you just give a brief sketch of who they are and what they're doing? And Elon is funding one of them, correct?
Elon has given money to the Future of Life Institute. I think he's also given money to MIRI. Jan Tallinn, who founded Skype, and Kazaa, has been seeding money behind the scenes with several of these organizations. Meritt, the Future of Life Institute, he gave money to. He also, the Future of Humanities Institute out of Oxford. And he started something at Cambridge, I think called the Center for Existential Risk, but I'm not sure if that's exactly the name. They're going at this in a variety of different ways. Meritt is trying to solve some of the hard math problems of creating AI that's friendly from the ground up. They have a good website. They're the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. Future of Life Institute has been really good at bringing together AI makers, people involved in AI, and AI skeptics and ethicists to try to create this environment where people aren't afraid to come out and show what they're doing and to get maybe some ethical guidance about it. Those are kind of the main guys. If you took all their budgets and put it against, the daily budget of a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon or a DARPA or a NSA, it would be minuscule. So on the one hand, you've got a lot of people working as fast as they can for superintelligence. I mean, Baidu has said that flat out. Baidu is kind of the Chinese Google. They want to make, they want to really kind of corner the market on human level intelligence in a machine. So you've got all these companies with billions and billions of dollars working hard to get to this solution that may be incredibly dangerous for us. And then you've got this tiny little pocket of people saying, hey, look over here. We're not making Legos. We're making something more like nuclear fission. We're making a technology that could really potentially destroy us.
When I first started hearing about Meritt in these groups, it gave me a lot of heart because it made me think of something that happened quite some time ago in the history of DNA manipulation, basically. I think it was called the Asilomar Conference. Asilomar is a conference facility in Northern California that's really lovely and out in the trees and so forth. And I think it was in 1975, as recombinant DNA was becoming something that scientists were starting to understand when we're realizing that we would eventually be in a position to manipulate. Very, very foresighted, lots and lots of scientists from throughout the world and throughout the field gathered at Asilomar and kind of came up with an ethical agenda, which governed the field for a very, very long time. And Meritt and so forth, seemed to be a similar spirit of that. The difference, though, is in 1975, there weren't mega multi-billion-dollar budgets pursuing DNA research in a headlong manner, and the rewards were not yet there. So it was possible for this sort of wizened gathering of rightly motivated scientists to seize and write the agenda.
No, in fact, the Future of Life Institute, Max Tegmark, the physicist, heads it up pretty much. They had a conference at Asilomar.
At Asilomar, interesting.
Yeah, they had one last January where they came up with some basic principles. Yes, in honor of just exactly that, the 1975 meeting you're referring to. So I hadn't realized that. So you can get you should. I urge people to Google Future of Life and Asilomar, and you'll probably come up with the 13 or 21 basic rules they came up with. Mm-hmm. But you're exactly right. Demis Hassabis, I think I've finally pronounced his name right. He founded DeepMind. DeepMind was bought by Google for $400 million. Demis recently came out and said, when the intelligence explosion occurs, he doesn't think that corporations will cooperate to control it. So he was flashing ahead to this event, the intelligence explosion, when machines are setting the pace of intelligence advancement, not humans anymore. At that point, it will require coordination among corporations to prevent that from happening or to kind of restrict it. The other interesting thing about him and Shane Legg is that when they sold the company, they made a condition of the sale, the establishment of an ethics board for using the technology.
Interesting. So
they have been coming forward and attending these kind of conferences with people that are concerned about the unrestricted development of AI.
And DeepMind's technology has been absolutely core to some of the strides that Google has made. Like, it was their software, the core of the system that beat the human expert in Go, correct?
Yes.
I'm pretty sure it was the DeepMind stuff that was also behind all those systems that started beating the old Atari games.
Yeah.
It was one of those things that when it happened at first, I felt it was kind of trivial. Like, okay, so it can beat an eighth grader. It can beat me when I was an eighth grader at a game that was around when I was an eighth grader. What's the big deal? But the big deal was it hadn't been taught what the objectives of the game were.
Yeah.
And it sussed those out so rapidly. It didn't know what a score was. It didn't know what winning was. But it did that, and it conquered this series of games with incredible rapidity. And again, it's like looking at the leap from checkers to Jeopardy. That leap happened. Analogous leaps will surely happen in the future. So speaking of the future, what is your state of optimism or pessimism at this point? Do you think we're doomed?
I tend to be very skeptical. And I have kids, and so I try to be optimistic. You can't live with this sort of foreboding 24/7.
Right.
I keep going back to fission. Right now, we're in a big crisis with North Korea, and it's because of nuclear fission. In the 1920s and 30s, when it was being developed, they thought it was a way to split the atom and get free energy. What happened is we quickly weaponized it, vaporized 2 cities, and then we kept a gun at our own heads as a species with the nuclear arms race, and we still haven't escaped the threat of nuclear fission. Unfortunately, AI is more sensitive than fission. In fact, in the introduction to the standard text on AI, the authors in the foreword say, by the way, AI is pretty much as dangerous as nuclear fission when it gets to be more advanced.
Really? This is the academic text that is predominantly used when people start studying this field.
Yes. Pick up a copy.
Wow.
Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, written by Norvig, who's the head of programming at Google.
A modern approach, as if there's an ancient approach. But still, that's interesting.
To me, our innovation runs way ahead of our stewardship. The innovation in this field is run by quarterly financial reports, not by safety and ethics concerns. I'm not confident that we'll get ahead of the quarterly reports. I'm not confident that we'll have the wisdom to let stewardship catch up to innovation in this case. And unfortunately, I think we can expect disastrous accidents, or maybe accidents that we can't recover from.
Yeah, because an accident, it's not like a plane crash or even like the vaporization of a city, which happened obviously twice, as you cited. The first accident could well be the last. And of course, your book has that chilling title, Our Final Invention.
Yeah, well, that kind of says, if you want to know my opinion, just look at that title, because I don't have a solution. I'm not sure anyone's got a solution. I think there are a lot of smart people thinking about it, and I'm given some confidence by that. I like the idea of transparency. I like the idea of, Elon Musk has started OpenAI, as he said, because he wants to see how it advances, because he's worried about it, not just because he wants to make money. So I give him terrific credit for being like one of the more prescient CEOs. And
you enter such a thicket when you start anthropomorphizing. I always say that wrong. You can think of just give it a really benign goal, like make people happy. But then we could end up, it could take that very literally, and we could end up being these basically husks that are hooked up to some IV drip and, a probe that stimulates the happiness centers in our brains. And that's not exactly the future that we want for ourselves and our children and grandchildren. And you could say, well, let's give it a goal that says, let's cure cancer. Well, it could cure cancer by annihilating all humans now. Cancer's gone. Yeah. It's like the thing that that's come up is called CEV. Is it cognitive
coherent
enhanced volition?
So you're touching on a couple of things that are really, there's so many interesting parts to AI, and AI is in such a profound way an exploration of ourselves, because we do explore psychology, we do explore logic and reasoning when we talk about AI. You're talking about coherent extrapolated volition, which is a term Eliezer Yudkowsky came up with. When you say, the AI may make us happy by just stimulating our pleasure centers, or it may, cure whooping cough by getting rid of all people, because it would lack common sense. So the question is, how do you program in common sense? How do you teach a machine about the world so well that it's not making stupid mistakes like killing me to save me?
Right.
The more powerful the architecture, the greater the severity for unintended consequences. So as we were saying before, it's very hard to define the basic human values, because they change over time. If we codified Roman values, we'd still believe in slaves. We'd wear togas. We'd have orgies. We'd go to the vomitorium every day. We do these things that we consider archaic now. Just as if we codified our ethics today, they would be archaic in 1,000 years. So what Eliezer proposes is something that he calls coherent extrapolated volition, and that's the machines would intuit what's best for us. They would intuit what we would like if we had more time to think about it. If we didn't have these, primitive mammal brains, these would be our ethics.
Yeah, it's almost, I think it's something like what we would do if we knew more, thought faster, and were more the people that we wish we were. And you've got to be smarter than us to know the answer to that question by definition.
What you learn from that idea is not so much the idea itself, but the nature of the challenge ahead of us. The nature of the challenge isn't simply to make friendly AI, it's to make intuitive AI. So that's actually raising the bar a lot.
Yeah, and the don't kill humans alone is so insufficient. And it's really funny, a lot of folks sort of remember that, didn't Isaac Asimov come up with the 3 laws of robots?
Right.
And isn't that enough? It's like, well, no.
Yeah.
He was writing many, many decades ago. And if anybody who reads iRobot, anybody who's read it will know that the entire book is about those rules not working. Like, that, he sort of lays them out as sort of a fun thought experiment in the first few pages. And then the remaining 99% of the book is about things going horribly wrong because they are inadequate and they come into conflict with one another. And so, no, that is not enough.
No.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you consider core to this, or do you feel like we've covered the bases pretty well?
I think we've covered the bases pretty well. Any conversation we can have is an introduction. So, I'd urge people to keep looking. And one thing I like to cover is this isn't a problem for technocrats. This isn't a problem for academia. This is a problem for everybody.
Yeah.
And it's really important for everybody to get as knowledgeable about it as they can so that they can take part in the conversation.
Yeah. And the one other thing, actually, just something popped into my head. When you think about the motivations that an emergent AI would have, going back to what you said about rational economic theory, what's it going to want to do? It's going to want to gather resources. It's not going to want to get switched off. Both of those things point to potentially a very long quiet period. If I were merely as smart as I am and woke up as an AI, let alone a super AI, I think my first instinct would be to hide.
Right.
Intuition doesn't suggest that it's already arisen, and I don't think that one has. But if one has arisen, unbeknownst to whether it's Watson or Google or something that Tencent or Baidu is working on, I think the first thing it would do would be to play dead for quite some time as it gathers resources and as it really hones its not getting shut off strategy, which is just a good sort of like ghost story way to end this otherwise very cheery conversation by saying, we don't really know that we're alone right now.
No.
If we were not alone right now, the world would probably look more or less exactly how it looks at this moment.
I actually pointed that out in the first chapter in this the busy child scenario in the book, and that's that.
Right.
The first thing it may do is copy itself and distribute itself so that when the time comes, it'll already be hidden when people realize how smart it is.
Oh, and thank you for reminding me of that. I want to point folks to that. For those of you who have not read James's book, the opening scene it's a very chilling sort of sci-fi sketch of what it might be like for a bunch of very well-intentioned researchers who are creating something that is writing self-improving code, and how it might suddenly dawn on them that they've created something overwhelmingly powerful that they have no control over. And you call it the busy child. Where did that phrase come from? Is that something you've come up with, or is busy child sort of a term of trade that's out there in the world?
Actually, it came from a note written by 2 members of royalty, Catherine Parr and Anne Boleyn, I think, were related, and one's unborn child was making her sick and ultimately killed her. And she wrote a consoling letter about the busy child inside her, and that made me think of AI.
Well, it is a very chilling and very evocative little fictional sketch that you make at the very opening of your book. And I believe if somebody has a digital reader, a Nook, a Kindle, whatever it is, and gets the sampler, that probably lands on your device. So I believe it would be freely available to most folks, and it's well worth reading because it's frightening.
Well, it was intended to be to lay out some of the problems of advanced AI right away, and to get people thinking about it. And one of those is that the intelligence that we create could be alien, and it could be very, very clever. It could be deceitful. It could use wile.
Yeah. Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Rob. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
And I've enjoyed it immensely and have a fantastic trip. I hope I haven't slowed your packing down too much.
Oh, no.
I look forward to staying in touch.
All right. Yeah, likewise.
Here's a quick message from Rob before Tom and I discuss my interview with James. You are now deep into a long podcast, which means you're a focused listener. I'd therefore like to make a quick pitch for the audiobook version of my novel After On. It's a truly amazing production, in part because it's not read by me, but by actual professionals from the realms of acting, comedy, and beyond. The part of Netgirl, a very opinionated blogger, is read by the inimitable Felicia Day, creator of the web series The Guild, performer on TV shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and so much more. The many Amazon reviews that are woven into the story, and yes, you heard that correctly, are read by the lovely and talented John Hodgman, actor, author, comedian, podcaster, and, to go back a few years, portrayer of the PC in Apple's famous I'm a Mac, I'm a PC TV commercials. The voice of the New York Times in the audiobook is the co-host of this podcast, Tom Meritt. The voice of the San Francisco Chronicle is tech broadcast veteran Leo Laporte. And the voice of a mysterious second novel that is excerpted repeatedly and After On is Patrick Rothfuss, the brilliant fantasy writer behind The Name of the Wind and other wonderful works. Other great voices include those of YouTuber Jesse Cox, Broadway actress January Lavoie, and Sean Kennan, whose voice you may know from Family Guy, The Smurfs, and much more. I'll add that at over 22 recorded hours, it's a pretty good entertainment value. You can find it on Audible or wherever fine audiobooks are sold. Now, back to our podcast.
Rob and I will now discuss the interview and sometimes make specific reference to the novel After On, particularly in this episode, pages 380 through 464. That's what's officially on today's roster. So if you aren't reading the book, you may experience occasional confusion. But since you've gotten this far, you'll still probably enjoy the discussion. Whereas if you're planning to read the novel, beware, spoilers ahead. So, Rob, James's book, Our Final Invention, came out right around the time you started writing After On, and it sounds like it was one of the many influences on your depiction of AI and, of course, the risks of AI.
Yeah, it was one of a few big ones. As I mentioned at the start of the podcast, James's book came out right before Nicholas Bostrom's book, and I actually read the two of them back to back. And around the same time, I also started reading a bunch of online pieces by Eliezer Yudkowsky, who James and I also talked about.
Now, fair enough. Is it true that those same three people influenced Beasley's sci-fi story about super AI risk starring Special Agent Brock Hogan?
Absolutely. But to avoid any issues with libel, I should make it very clear that it's their ideas and not their writing styles that influenced Beasley. But yes, a lot of Agent Hogan's terminology and the sorts of scenarios that he encounters come from this literature. Concepts like infrastructure perfusion, which happens when the AI starts turning Agent Hogan's entire planet into a computing substrate, or perverse instantiation, when the AI wires everybody up to brain-frying machines because it's been instructed to make people happy. Also, the concept of decisive strategic advantage.
Let me make sure I have this right. Decisive strategic advantage is the theory that the first super AI would also be the last one because its compounding self-improvement would always keep it ahead of the competition.
Exactly. And this happens to be a good time to remind listeners who are also reading the novel along with us of that concept because it's about to re-enter the storyline in a significant way.
What a crazy coincidence.
Yes, indeed. Podcasting and literature just go hand in hand with serendipity.
Speaking of reading, would you recommend James's and Bostrom's book to listeners? Are they required reading?
Well, I'd advise anyone, and I do advise a lot of people, to start with James's book because it's very accessible, but it doesn't pull any punches about the core concepts or the dangers we face. Now, if someone wants to get deeper after reading James's book, Nick Bostrom's book is definitely step 2, and it's called Superintelligence: Paths, Dangers, Strategies.
Now, earlier in this episode, you described Bostrom's book as being much more academic.
Yeah, and every meaning of the word, actually. Nick is a deep-thinking Oxford philosopher. His book was published by the Oxford University Press, and it's every bit as dense and as serious as all of that should imply. But James's book is actually kind of perfect preparation for reading it, if you dare.
Now, there are always people not worried despite having read After On and listening to your interview. What do you recommend for people who want to learn more about AI for fun and profit while humanity is still allowed to occupy this planet, or those inevitable few who want to hasten the rise of our robot overlords?
Well, for those who'd like to hasten the rise of our robot overlords, there's no better tool for your duplicity than a book called The Master Algorithm by Pedro Domingos. It's a really thorough introduction to several approaches that developers are taking to AI and machine learning. He argues, and he literally uses this word, that the field is essentially tribal, in that people are highly devoted to the AI approaches that they've trained in and affiliated with, to the point of not actually learning useful lessons from other approaches. So he lays out really robust introductions to all of the principal approaches, and then he invites readers to actually consider making their own contributions to the field to try to unify it. And he's actually convinced that even completely non-technical people could have a lot to add to it because it's all so new, which is very flattering to me as a non-technical person.
And yes, anything that will hasten the rise of Flutter is a fantastic idea. All kidding aside, when I read about Flutter in After On, it sounded very disconcerting, but your interview today made me think Flutter is actually a fairly optimistic scenario.
She certainly isn't the extreme case annihilator that we can imagine emerging from all this.
Ironically, that's in part because Kuba took an approach that you and James describe as very dangerous, which is designing AI software around elements of the human brain, elements that we don't really understand.
Exactly. Neuromorphic code, as Nick Bostrom calls it, although, as I mentioned in the interview, neuromimetic might be a better term.
Yeah, when you said neuromimetic in the interview, that clicked with me because of the idea of imitation, mirroring that it connotes. Now, we discussed this in some depth after listening to Steve Jurvetson's interview on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, although in that episode, we really focused on the downside of this.
We did. And in fact, in that discussion, I quoted Bostrom's warning that in mimicking the brain, imitation can substitute for understanding. And a lack of understanding is obviously dangerous when you're building something that could easily replace you at the top of the food chain. But there could also be an upside to embedding some of what makes us human into our creations, which is that they may actually pick up on some of our finer qualities as well.
Well, let's get back to Flutter in the story. Flutter's starting to show some hints of humanity. Now, I don't mean to spoil here. I'm not telling you, dear readers, if she will continue that way or not. However, I am hopeful, and I could use a little more hope. Is there any hope for me there? Are there any fictional treatments of AI you recommend, along with all this somewhat filled with warning nonfiction we've been talking about?
Well, yeah, they're definitely wonderful fictional treatments of AI, but I'm afraid that for the most part, they're not very optimistic. To me, the best recent big screen treatment was definitely Ex Machina, which came out in 2015. And I'm sure that a lot of our listeners have seen it, but it's amazing to me how many people have not seen it. It actually wasn't a very big grossing movie. So if you haven't seen it, I cannot recommend this movie enough. It's chilling. It's surprising. The performances are amazing. And even though I'm not a huge fan of robots that precisely resemble people in near future fiction, I'm fine with it in Ex Machina's case because it's just so brilliant.
Yes, I would not describe Ex Machina as hopeful, at least not for us organic humans, but I absolutely agree. It's a fantastic story. However, you just mentioned you don't like perfectly humanoid robots in near future fiction. Why is that?
Well, I just don't see it as a realistic near future development. Robots are an extension of the Industrial Revolution in my mind, at least as much as they are an extension of the digital revolution. And industrial advancements are more arithmetic than exponential. I mean, yeah, machines get more fuel efficient over time, servo motors get smaller, actuators get more nimble, but that moves in fairly steady linear ways. So while I'm sure we're closer to perfectly humanoid robots today than we were, 10 years ago, we're not radically closer, which suggests to me that it will be many, many more 10-year intervals before we get there. And during that time, we'll probably have advances in VR or even in projecting experiences directly into the mind that will make the meticulous replication of human bodies in physical space almost like an unnecessary stunt.
Yeah, I mean, when you can kick something as large as the Big Dog robot from Boston Dynamics over with your foot, even as convincing as it is, we've got a ways to go.
We got a ways to go.
So getting back to self-aware AI, what other fictional depictions are you a fan of?
Well, Rick and Morty recently took a really fun swipe at the idea of self-aware AI. And for those who haven't seen it yet, Rick and Morty's a Comedy Central cartoon, which is surely one of the smartest, funniest, and darkest science fiction series of all time. It's just in its third season, and they've already tackled pretty much every science fiction trope in history. So God knows where they'll go from here. To get a little bit more obscure, a Polish science fiction author named Stanislaw Lem took all kinds of fascinating looks at artificial consciousness way back in the 60s. And I love his work because it's not just thought-provoking, but it's often hysterically funny, like Rick and Morty, although it's a little less dark than Rick and Morty, which isn't saying much. So the book to start with Stanislaw Lem is The Cyberiad, Cyberiad. It's a collection of short stories that just delights me every bit as much today as when I first read it as a 12-year-old. And if you like that, that's your gateway drug to Stanislaw Lem. He wrote a lot of stuff, and he wrestles with the issues of artificial consciousness many times.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Cyberiad. I'm a huge Stanislav Lem fan, and I've made the mistake of giving people the wrong Stanislav Lem to start with. And I think Cyberiad is definitely the right Stanislav Lem. Even Solaris, which is, I think, his more popular novel, if anybody's heard of one, isn't as fun and as accessible as the Cyberiad. So much better. And Rob, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you might turn out to be a big fan of another book called After On, when we finish reading the book next week.
We're just a week away. Exactly.
We'll talk to people then.
We will.